Feel free to pause and rewind the video at any point throughout our discussion today. So today we're starting our evolution unit. Evolution is what makes life possible. It allows organisms to adapt to their environment as it changes. It's also responsible for diversity of life on Earth. Evolution makes living things different from one another, but also shows us how we're all related. Okay, so before we move on, let's review one of the concepts we learned about in the genetics unit. Think back to what selective breeding was. Basically, it's getting the traits that we want. For example, if I wanted a big, muscular brown dog, then I may pick a male dog that is big and muscular, and a female dog with the brown color that I like, and breed them together to get the offspring I want. Big, muscular, and brown. Well, Darwin thought that if so much can be achieved artificially in a short time, then it can also occur in nature. Artificial selection can be very beneficial to farmers, for example, because it allows them to get lots of change in a relatively short time. So as we go through this discussion, we're actually going to see the testable data that scientists have gathered to prove that evolution is a theory. Alright, so when you think of evolution, you probably think of the name Darwin, right? Well, before Darwin, there was a guy named John Lamarck. Let's call him Lamarck for short. What he actually believed was that acquired changes are passed to offspring. Let me give you an example. Say I got some gauges and stretched my ears out really wide. When I have children, will they be born with huge holes in their ears? No, but that's like what Lamarck thought. He also thought that if you don't use a body part, that it would disappear. So since I'm left-handed, let's say I never use my right hand. Would my right hand disappear over time? Definitely not. I'm not sure what Lamarck was thinking. He's crazy. Lamarck observed that giraffes have disproportionately long necks. He also observed that giraffes seem to be built perfectly for eating the leaves from the tops of the trees. He hypothesized that the original giraffe had a normal-sized neck, but that by constantly stretching its neck up to reach the leaves on higher branches, the neck became stronger and longer, and each generation would therefore have a slightly longer neck than before. Another theory was from economist Thomas Malthus. He believed that if the population grew too much to where more babies were being born than dying, that they would run out of space and food. Darwin actually took this theory and applied it to animals. Charles Darwin was only 22 when he embarked on a 5-year voyage around the world on a ship named the HMS Beagle. He was able to use the ideas of artificial selection and population growth to formulate his hypotheses about evolution and natural selection. Darwin did not agree with Lamarck's theories. He thought he was absolutely crazy. If you follow the red line on the map, you can actually see the route that Darwin took on his journey. Darwin's most remarkable observations were actually made on the Galapagos Islands off the coast of South America. His many observations led him to believe that species slowly change over time. Darwin compared the animals of South America to those of the Galapagos Islands and found that there were significant differences. This caused him to conclude that animals adapt to their environment, which causes diversity among organisms and can actually cause the origin of new species. Argentina and Australia have similar habitats, but Darwin noticed that each had different species of animals. This is an example of the patterns of diversity, when plants and animals seem well suited to their environment. Darwin also observed fossils and noticed that some resembled organisms that were still alive, but that others were completely different. The Galapagos Islands actually consist of 18 different islands. What Darwin noticed was that species varied from island to island. He found that each island had either long or short-necked tortoises depending on the vegetation on the island. Vegetation just means the plants in the area. So if they had short necks, what did they eat? Probably vegetation low to the ground like grasses and shrubs. What about those with longer necks? Well, you could guess that they would be able to reach further up into the bushes and eat those. Biogeography is the study of where species live now and where species and their ancestors lived in the past. This can actually provide clues to common ancestry in two ways. It's evidence as to how closely related species differentiated under different selection pressures. We'll talk more about Darwin's finches later. And it also is evidence as to how distantly related groups have evolved similar traits under similar selection pressures. probably the most memorable of Darwin's observations would be of the finches. This is a type of bird that resembled a mainland finch, but was only found on the Galapagos Islands. There were a wide variety of them, finches of different nesting sizes, beak sizes, and eating habitats. Those with bigger beaks probably ate larger seeds, and those with smaller and thinner beaks probably ate smaller seeds and ate small insects. This diagram shows 10 species of finches that each fill a different niche on various islands. I want you to make a note to the side of the word niche. Write out that the word niche means an organism's role in the environment. Each one of these finches evolved from one ancestral species. Make another note that this is an example of adaptive radiation, where the finches adapted to their environment from one original species of finch and then radiated into new different species of finches. So let's talk about Darwin's theory of evolution. Darwin decided that adaptations develop over time. An adaptation is a variation that makes an organism more successful in its environment. Both Darwin and Alfred Wallace proposed natural selection as a driving mechanism of evolution. Natural selection is when organisms with adaptations that are well suited to their environment tend to survive and reproduce more than those organisms that are not very well adapted to their environment. The long-term survival of any species is possible only if the organism is able to reproduce successfully. Organisms that are most fit to reproduce are selected by the environment. I want you to take your notes and put a star by the word fitness, and then go ahead and put a star by survival of the fittest. Fitness has two key parts, surviving and also reproducing. If you have really good traits to survive in a certain area, but you can't pass those traits on to any offspring, then your species won't continue on. Okay, so you're going to star this whole section. You must know these 4 conditions for natural selection. First, there must be genetic variation among members of the population. Second, many more individuals are produced each generation than will survive. Third, some are better adapted so they tend to survive and reproduce. Fourth, members of a population tend to compete for food, space, and mates. Okay, so you got to remember that those that are better adapted are more fit. Since they're more fit, they survive and are able to leave more offspring. This causes that genetic variation to become more prevalent in a population. The word prevalent means more dominant or widespread. Going back to genetics, remember that we get genetic variation through meiosis, which is the production of gametes, the sperm and egg cells. Natural selection tends to affect populations. This causes populations of the same species living in different places to become more and more different than each other as they become better adapted to their own environment. This may lead to reproductive isolation, which is when 2 populations that are the same species don't interbreed with each other. This happens because of things like geographical barriers. The 2 can't breed because they are at different locations. We call this geographic isolation. If somehow a squirrel crossed the Grand Canyon, it would not mate with other squirrels because they have become 2 distinct species of squirrel over time. Some species do not breed because of differences in behaviors like mating rituals. This is what we call behavioral isolation. One last type of reproductive isolation is temporal isolation. This is when species don't breed because they mate at different times of the year. Common descent basically states that all species, living and extinct, came from common ancestors. This common ancestry can be supported by fossil evidence. While all species came from a common ancestor, species have descended over time with modifications. Darwin called this descent with modification. Once Darwin's 5-year voyage was over, he returned to England. Darwin was a huge procrastinator. He didn't publish any of his findings from his trip until 20 years later, and he only published his book after he found out that Alfred Wallace was about to claim the same things that Darwin had already discovered. So we're actually going to stop here and continue on in the notes a different day. The following video you're going to watch explains how evolution really works.
How does evolution really work?
The primary way that evolution occurs is through the action of natural selection. That is, populations change in response to environmental pressures, and they become adapted to new conditions, and they change over time.
Following Charles Darwin's lead, biologist Chris Schneider and his colleagues traveled to Ecuador to study the evolution of several animal species. This lush rainforest is a natural laboratory for ongoing investigation of evolutionary theory. Natural selection is at the core of their research on hummingbirds.
In our research, we're trying to understand how new species arise. This is Darwin's fundamental question. On the origin of species, how do new species arise? And what we're finding is that natural selection seems to be an incredibly important factor in generating new species.
Natural selection, the key evolutionary mechanism Darwin identified, is really four processes: genetic variation, overproduction of offspring, struggle for existence, and differential survival and reproduction. First, genetic variation. Individuals within a species vary from one to the other. For evolution to work by natural selection, the characteristics that give an individual an advantage in a certain environment have to be passed on from one generation to the next.
And in hummingbirds, bill length seems to have a very strong genetic basis. That is, if two parents mate and both of those parents have long bills, their offspring will have long bills. If those parents have shorter bills, their offspring will have shorter bills.
Second, there is overproduction of offspring.
Darwin realized that natural selection would operate because individuals in natural populations tend to produce more offspring than can survive. For example, hummingbirds over their lifetime will often produce dozens of offspring, but only one or two of those individuals are likely to survive.
The third factor in natural selection is the struggle for existence, and that leads to differential survival and reproduction.
In any population, whether it's plants or animals or whatever, this excess production of individuals results in what Darwin called the struggle for existence. And what he had in mind there, I think, was the competition for food and space and mates as well. Hummingbirds compete for nectar. They often compete very fiercely for limited resources. Natural selection will favor individuals that are more efficient at getting nectar, and natural selection will result in changes in wing shape that allow hummingbirds to fly longer distances, for instance, or maybe to be more maneuverable, to maneuver around flowers and get nectar more efficiently. And probably most importantly, it'll affect the length and shape of the bill.
Bill measurements.
In the case of hummingbirds, we know that a 1 or 2 millimeter change in length can have profound differences on how efficiently that bird feeds and how well it survives.
Individual survivors are more likely to reproduce and pass on their advantageous as well as other genes to their offspring. In an environment with long flowers, having a long bill is an advantageous trait. Not necessarily the absolute best trait always, just a better one in this environment. Hummingbirds with small bills may not survive, and eventually there will only be hummingbirds with long bills. Over a long period of time, the entire population of hummingbirds adapts to the shape and size of the flowers that exist in that environment.
If you're in the woods and you're walking with another person and you come on a bear and the bear chases you, you don't have to be faster than the bear. You only have to be faster than the other person because the bear eats them and you get away.
Species cannot develop the adaptations that benefit them in their lifetimes. Just as you cannot make your arm longer to reach a book on the shelf up high, individual small-billed hummingbirds that move into an area where there are longer flowers can't make their bills longer. Their bill length is determined by the DNA they inherited from their parents.
3.
Schneider uses hummingbird DNA sequences to reconstruct their evolutionary history as it has been shaped by natural selection. Genetic variation, overproduction of offspring, struggle for existence, and differential survival and reproduction.
We're just essentially doing what Darwin did, but with a bunch of fancy new tools. We're using molecular biology, we're using modern computational methods and all these things, but we're just doing basic natural history, really.
Metallura.
And in the hummingbirds, we found that many of the species are relatively young. That is, they've evolved in the last 2 or 3 million years, which is pretty quick on an evolutionary timescale. Darwin emphasized over and over, I mean repeatedly in The Origin of Species, the fact that small changes would accrue every generation, and that over the enormous length of time that life has been present on Earth, these changes could build up to amount to enormous changes.
It was Charles Darwin's genius to have identified natural selection as the central force in evolution.
And I think that in research over the last 10 or 15 years has really supported that. I think most evolutionary biologists would agree that natural selection is probably the single most important force in evolution.